Okay, so I'm going to hand this one over to Oliver because I have no idea what game it is that he's testing
I
here,
also don't
except that it's
know.
called Wayfinder, and except that he's tested it on the PlayStation 5. I'm now looking at a video on our YouTube channel that's unlisted called Wayfinder Export Sample. Oliver, can you take it away here? What's going on here? What is this game?
Yeah, so this is an interesting title, I think. It launched in early access last year as a kind of MMO third-person shooter action game, but it's kind of an MMO in the modern sense where you have like shards and instances and things like this, but it is still an open world multiplayer title. And it relied heavily on action combat as opposed to tab targeting. And I was keeping an eye on it. I am very interested in MMOs, still am, and I was keeping an eye on it. But there were big technical problems, issues with queues. Plus, it was free to play, which is kind of something that always leaves a bit of a bad taste in the mouth, even if I understand it's kind of necessary for a lot of these games, because you kind of become the product instead of the game there. And the game is, oftentimes using a bit of an exploitative business model and stat boosts and things like that. I don't think that went on with Wayfinder, but it just was not that appealing to me. And of course, it's an MMO, so it requires a certain online infrastructure. And unfortunately, it ended up with very low player counts. Their publisher, Digital Extremes, they make Warframe. They just dissolved their whole publishing division. So the developers went towards
Oh, phew.
self-publishing, and it still wasn't successful. But they decided, like Final Fantasy XIV, to do a bit of a revival and reboot the game. But this time, instead of making it an MMO, they decided to make it a single player RPG with optional co op. So it's a very similar game. They've reworked a lot of the systems, the balancing, the item acquisition. They've converted all the paid cosmetics that were previously in the game to in game items. And instead of pricing it at a free to play price, they've just said it's $25 US or $33 Canadian with no other costs at present. So just a straight purchase, no cosmetics, no DLC, nothing. All the content in the game, which I think is a really interesting way to spin this back up and try to make it a success. So I checked it out on PS5 yesterday. It just got released on Tuesday after a period in early access, and this is like the full 1.0 release. So visually, I think it looks quite nice. It's UE4 and not anything too crazy, but the art looks great. The cities in particular have a lot of geometric density and interesting designs and cool looking art. It's a very good looking game for a multiplayer centric title in particular, I would say. I think it's a very satisfying Unreal Engine 4 title for a multiplayer title. That's how I'd put it. It's something extraordinary, but artistically it's quite pleasing. On PS5, there are two modes, quality and performance. The big difference here is that the performance mode gets a bit of a settings cut. Like grass density and shadows are both compromised in the performance mode, but this is like a really weird configuration because the performance mode drops TAA entirely. Like maybe there's post
Right.
AA. I think there's post AA in there, but it looks pretty raw, really unstable in motion. And then the other weird thing about it is that both the quality mode and the performance mode to me counted at 1080p, which is weird too. So it's like, oh, that's so strange to have so much commonality between them, but then have these settings downgrades that are probably pretty marginal in terms of performance impact, I'd imagine, for a UE4 title. The other weird thing is that in the menu it says the quality mode targets 30 FPS and the performance mode targets 60, so pretty typical split there. But in reality, both target 60 FPS. Like they'll both run unlocked up to 60. There's no 120 hertz support, but they'll run up to 60. And then this is kind of where things get more interesting, perhaps, because indoors both run at 60 perfectly fine. But outdoors, both of them are kind of not quite equally compromised, but quite heavily compromised in the sense they both have quite severe traversal stutters, judging from the frame times when they're running around. The performance mode is a little bit better in the combat encounters in the outdoor areas, but the quality mode really suffers there. So it's like, but both have the traversal stutters, which is very annoying there. So yeah, I think it's an interesting game. It's a fun game. I think the combat is very good. It's reasonably polished. It's well worth checking out if you like MMOs or maybe grindy RPGs here, because that's essentially what it is. I think $25 is a pretty fair price. But you kind of come back to the engine tech, and well, Unreal Engine 4 is delivering some good visuals here. That traversal stutter is kind of a just kind of irritating for this open world game or open environment game where you're traversing lots of space, you're seeing lots of assets at once, and UE4 is just not coping that well. So Yeah, I mean, I imagine PCs maybe a little bit better on a high-end rig, but you'd probably still run into the same problems there. So I don't know, an interesting game. I'll keep playing it. And the indoor areas are like you do spend a lot of time there, and they do run a lot better for sure. But it's just those outdoor areas with UE4. It's just not a great combination, unfortunately.
I'm curious as to, I mean, I'm assuming this was 33 of your own well earned Canadian bucks that you
Yes.
laid down for this. So I'm kind of curious as to, was it just the narrative, this idea of a free to play game that's suddenly become a single player fest that made you buy it? I'm curious as to how this came onto your radar.
Well, I was interested in it from when they like announced it, I think in 2022. I thought it was an interesting title and an interesting game. But like when it comes to those MMO titles, I mean the free to play part of it was a big factor, but with MMO titles, you kind of tend to sometimes not want to be there on day one sometimes, especially if you otherwise have a busy schedule. Because like I remember 10 years ago with WildStar, which I also played, big MMO project from a lot of ex Blizzard people. Very exciting game, very good game, but it folded within like a year or two just because the player interest
Right.
wasn't quite there. So I'm always a little bit nervous about new MMO projects, and I'm especially nervous about free to play ones because it's just not a business model that you'd like. And even if initially it's just cosmetics and you're like, okay, fine, cosmetics, whatever, pretty soon, if you're in dire straits, you move on to the pay to win stuff. That's almost inevitably what happens if the game is not successful, sometimes even if it is successful. So, yeah, it's a combination of the fact that it was an unproven MMO and the fact that it was free to play. But now that I've come back to it, I think it's quite a good game. It's just kind of a shame that there are some issues that are pretty fundamental here. Probably won't be addressed. Configuration on PS5 is kind of funny, but not bad necessarily. I'd, for the most part, just play on that quality mode. That's my advice. Don't touch the performance mode. You don't get don't get TA. It's not a good looking experience. And the performance level is pretty similar between the two. It's just that fundamental traversal stutter issue you're going to run into regardless of visual settings, I think.
Fair enough, John. I've been watching your feed here. Looks like you've been tuned out for the most part.
Uh,
Any input?
well, I mean, I think the story around this is super interesting. I think it's cool, and I wish this the success. It's just the way Oliver talked about it. The only walk away I have from this is that it's MMO. It used to be an MMO, and he doesn't like the performance. So what is it about, like, what when you play this game, like what are you loving about it? Like what's the elements that say, man, playing this game feels awesome, like gameplay wise, like what's cool about this?
Well, I mean, I've only played for a few hours, so I couldn't really offer a considered opinion considering how long
Well,
these games can be.
true, but like,
Yeah.
any I feel like any good video game, even an MMO like that,
What's the
within
hook?
within the first like 30 minutes, you should have a good sense of like why this is worth continuing to play.
Yeah.
And because of their good story, I'm actually curious to hear more about it, because that's like a cool thing to support, you know?
Uh-huh. I think they do a good job combining like action combat that is very shooting focused, and there are three different kind of characters and classes. So the character that I picked was more shooting focused, but there's also a melee combat character and a more stealthy character.
Hmm.
They do a good job of combining kind of combo based gameplay with very twitch and action oriented gameplay. I think that's the interesting thing to me. It's not just tab targeting, but it's also not something in the total other direction like Destiny or The Division, where it's basically
Right.
just kind of a conventional third person shooter. It's somewhere in the middle. There are abilities on timers, there is a combo system, but also all abilities are aimed, which is different from that traditional tab targeting system. And the combat feels pretty good. It's a little bit floaty. It's not quite as polished as you might see in some other titles. That's my feeling at the moment. But it's also a pretty interesting approach to things. And I think that, like, overall visual package as well is quite compelling, because it's very rare that you see an MMO style game look like this and work like this in terms of that open environment that actually is delivering a really high level of art quality. Like even out of modern World of Warcraft expansions or something, you aren't getting this level of artistic quality. I think it's very impressive looking. So it's really the combination of that really strong visual appearance and then this interesting combat system. But yeah, I've only played a couple hours. That's my early impressions of it, and it does seem like it expands as you go along. lots of new abilities, lots of new elements to the game, lots of new items, combat, whatever, new guns, things like this. So it's a very extensible game in that respect. Like, they built a game with the expectation that as an MMO, you needed to pack it with hundreds of hours of content. That's my impression.
Right.
Grind the end game, things like that. Now that's still here, but it's just single player. Oh, with optional co-op elements as well. So you can have like a little 3-person co-op party. But it is a very different way to frame a game like this. But it is still basically an MMO, just a single player one. So I think that's an interesting spin on things. But yeah, I think that's basically my my appeal there.
I hope they find success. This sounds like a difficult situation. My first impression looking at your video was like, oh, it's Fortnite graphics. It just looks like a Fortnite style game. It's that same like cartoony, over stylized humans running around. But based on what you're saying and what they've been through, it actually does seem like a fairly decent game. And I think it's really cool they were able to shift from that MMO model into sort of a single player game with optional multiplayer. That's cool. And man, yeah, I wish them the best, because it's tough out there right now. So yeah, cool.
Absolutely.